January 1943. The Leningrad front, 4 in the morning. The temperature is so far below zero that the snow has stopped making sound. It does not crunch. It barely yields. It just holds hard and gray like packed stone. And somewhere in that gray, a young woman is digging herself in. Her name is Shura Erenshtein. Everyone calls her Shura. She is a Jewish woman from Riga, Latvia, who was working as a frontline medical orderly 11 months ago. She is now a trained Red Army sniper, and she has been given a task tonight that her commander, when he writes about it years later, will describe as requiring something beyond ordinary courage, beyond patriotism, beyond duty. Her orders are to silence a knocked-out German tank that German soldiers have been using as a firing position, a machine gun inside, a crew that has been killing Soviet soldiers all week. Shura's division has tried other approaches. Nothing has worked. So they sent her. She goes out before dawn, alone. She finds her position in the snow, and then she lies still and she waits. The cold is extraordinary, the kind of cold that begins as pain and then becomes something else entirely. She cannot move. Movement means discovery. Discovery means death. She simply has to hold the position until the Germans come. In the morning, 2 German soldiers carry breakfast out to the tank. She fires once. One falls, she fires again. The second falls. A third soldier climbs out of the hatch to see what happened. She fires again. Then she sends several rounds into the open hatch. The machine gun falls silent. It is over in seconds. Getting there took hours. Shura lies in the frozen ground until evening, unable to withdraw, unable to move, her limbs so cold she can barely feel them. When she finally returns to her unit in the dark, her commander writes that she came back frozen. Completely frozen. And lucky. If you want to understand why a Jewish woman from Riga was lying alone in the snow on the Leningrad front with a sniper rifle, waiting for 3 men to die, you need to understand what had happened to the Jews of Europe. And you need to understand something that the Red Army's own political leadership was forced to put in writing. Subscribe before we go further, because this is the story they buried for 50 years, and you deserve to know it. June 22, 1941. It is a Sunday. The German army crosses the Soviet border at dawn with 3 million men. Operation Barbarossa, the largest military invasion in human history. Within hours, hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers are encircled, captured, killed. The Wehrmacht advances at a pace that stuns even its own commanders. In the cities of the Soviet Union, people wake up to the sound of radio announcements, and then they do different things. Some panic, some wait, some begin planning evacuation. The Jews do something else. They volunteer. In Moscow, in Leningrad, in Odessa, in Kiev, in Riga, Jewish men and women present themselves at recruitment offices in numbers that are immediately, measurably disproportionate. In Moscow alone, 140,000 Jews lived in a city of 5 million. They contributed to the Red Army at a rate higher than any comparable group. In Leningrad, 130,000 Jews did the same. The Yad Vashem research team, which has spent years documenting the individual histories of Jewish Red Army soldiers through personal letters, diaries, and archival records, notes that these volunteers were driven by something that went beyond ordinary patriotism. In many cases, it was a fury that had not yet found its full shape. Because in the early weeks of the invasion, most Soviet Jews did not yet know what was happening in the territories the Wehrmacht was rolling over. They did not know about the Einsatzgruppen. They did not yet know about the mass shootings in the ravines and forests of Ukraine. They would learn about these things later, when the army moved west, when the liberated towns were not towns anymore. In the summer of 1941, what they knew was this: Germany had invaded, and they wanted to fight. Fischl Dershowitz Sakhin was 93 years old when the Blavatnik Archive Foundation recorded his testimony. He had fought in the Red Army from the first days of the war, and when researchers asked him about the moment he enlisted, he said something very simple. He said, "Immediately, I and many others volunteered to serve in the army. We wanted to be sent to the front. Not just to serve, to be sent to the front." There is a distinction in that sentence. In wartime armies, being sent to the front means the dangerous places, the forward positions, the assignments where survival rates compress toward zero. When Sakin says they wanted to be sent to the front, he is saying something about a specific quality of will that is very hard to manufacture in a soldier. You cannot train it into someone. You can only find it. And the Red Army found it in 1941 in their Jewish soldiers, in numbers that could not be explained by chance. Clara Grigorievna Rinkina was a medic. She was 5 feet tall, a pleasant-faced woman from Minsk who would spend decades after the war living quietly near Boston, wearing her medals on special occasions. When the Blavatnik researchers recorded her testimony in 2014, she was 91 years old. She had fought at the front. She wore her medals. And when they asked why she had enlisted, she said she had gone to find a recruiter in 1941 after German forces entered her town. Her parents had been killed. They were the first of 49 members of her family to die at the hands of the Nazis. She said, "I want to go to the front." Not a retreat, not a shelter, not a border crossing, the front. This was the pattern. This was the thing the Red Army noticed. And this is where the history becomes extraordinary. By August 1941, 6 weeks into the invasion, the Red Army was forming its first national division from the newly occupied Baltic states. The 201st Latvian Rifle Division was built from the remains of Latvian units that had fought in the first catastrophic weeks of the war. It was organized at an army camp near Gorky in the late summer, drawing in Latvian-speaking soldiers, militia members, and construction battalions, and a very large number of Latvian Jews who had fled east ahead of the Wehrmacht. By December 1941, the division had over 10,000 soldiers. Of those 10,000 soldiers, 17% were Jewish. In a country where Jews made up roughly 5% of Latvia's pre-war population, that is not an accident of demographics. It is a choice, made by thousands of individuals, repeated over and over, to go to the most dangerous place available. At least 70 Jewish members of the division were members of the Baader Zionist movement, young men who, before the Soviet annexation of Latvia, had been training specifically to defend Jewish settlements in Palestine. They had come to fight for one future, and ended up fighting in an entirely different war, for different reasons in different snow. In early 1942, Shura Erenshtein joined this division as a medical orderly. She had fled Riga on the last available train when the Germans invaded with her parents, her 4 siblings, and 3 nieces and nephews. They were going east to Uzbekistan. Her mother died during the journey. One of her sons died during the journey. One of her nephews died. When the survivors finally arrived in Uzbekistan, food was scarce, and her father died of typhus. Shura sent her younger brothers to an orphanage. She was the oldest surviving member of her family. And then she volunteered. Not for a safe posting, not for translation work, not for a supply depot somewhere behind the lines. She presented herself as a medical orderly to the 125th Rifle Regiment of the 43rd Latvian Division, which was heading for the most dangerous front in the entire war. She was going north, toward Leningrad, toward the siege. She was not unusual, she was the pattern. In 1942 and 1943, the Red Army's political leadership, the GPUKA, the main political directorate of the Workers' and Peasants' Red Army, began formally observing what every frontline commander already knew informally. They put it in writing. The document states that the most loyal elements in the Red Army during this difficult phase of the war were, in their assessment, 2 groups: Russians defending the motherland, and Jewish soldiers. Think about what it means for a bureaucratic institution, a Soviet institution, which preferred to speak in terms of the United Soviet people rather than individual nationalities. To write a document in the middle of a catastrophic war and say, there are two groups fighting harder than everyone else, Russians defending their homeland from an invader, and Jews. The document does not use the word revenge. Soviet documents of that period almost never used that word in reference to Jews, but anyone reading it who had followed the pattern of Jewish volunteering, Jewish casualties, Jewish decorations, knew what the underlying force was. By the time the Red Army began moving west in 1943 and 1944, liberating the villages and towns of Ukraine and Belarus and the Baltic states, Jewish soldiers were the first to encounter what had happened. They entered towns that had been home to tens of thousands of Jews. The Jews were gone, not evacuated, gone. They found mass graves. They found emptied ghettos. They found collaborators who told them casually what had happened and where the bodies were buried. And then they found, as the advance continued, the camps. Anna S.H. Turnchees, a researcher who spent years recording oral history interviews with Soviet Jewish veterans, writes about what happened to the motivation of these soldiers when they finally understood the full scale of what had been done. She interviewed a veteran who described it this way, recorded in the Blavatnik archive. I only took consolation in the fact that I killed more Germans than they did of my own family. That sentence, the arithmetic of grief in a single sentence, the attempt to find some equilibrium between private loss and public action, this was what was powering the Jewish soldiers of the Red Army, not propaganda, not ideology, something much older and much harder. On February 12, 1943, exactly 21 days after Operation Iskra broke the blockade of Leningrad, an army commissar named Abram Margalis, commanding the 32nd Infantry Division, submitted a formal proposal to the Red Army's High Command. He called for the formation of a dedicated Jewish fighting division. He cited the scale of the suffering Jews were experiencing at the hands of the Nazis. He cited their combat record. He cited their motivation. He made the case in writing. The proposal was rejected. Soviet wartime propaganda required the image of a united Soviet people, Russians and Ukrainians and Latvians and Uzbeks fighting together under one red banner. A separate Jewish formation contradicted that image. It acknowledged the particular nature of what was being done to Jews, which the Soviet state was not yet ready to acknowledge in public. And so the proposal was declined. The Jewish soldiers went back to their units and went on fighting. Shura Erenshtein had been serving as a medical orderly on the Leningrad front when she completed her sniper training. Her commander, Janis Griva, writes about her in his post-war memoir with a word that translates from Russian as snow maiden. It is a fairy tale figure, a girl of winter. He did not mean it romantically. He meant she was uncanny in the cold. She belonged in it in a way that made everyone else look like they were merely enduring it. She was precise. She was patient. She was, by all documented accounts, extraordinarily calm. When she received the orders to silence the German tank on the Leningrad front, her commander records that she went out before dawn without argument. She prepared her position in the frozen ground. She lay still. She waited. The sniper's fundamental weapon is not the rifle. It is stillness, the ability to become, for hours at a time, something that the landscape does not notice. In the Second World War, Soviet snipers were trained to understand this not as an abstract tactical principle, but as a physical practice that had to be mastered until it was instinct. The Germans were looking for movement. The snow was looking for heat. Everything was hostile to the human body lying in it, trying to be invisible. Shura Erenshtein lay in the snow for hours. She neutralized the position. She then lay still for additional hours because moving too soon would mean discovery. And when she finally returned to her regiment, her commander writes that she came back frozen. But she came back. By the time the war ended, Shura Erenshtein had 70 confirmed kills. She had fought through Operation Iskra, the January 1943 offensive, where 4,900 Soviet artillery pieces opened simultaneously along a 10-kilometer front, and Soviet soldiers crossed the frozen Neva River under direct fire to break the siege of Leningrad. She had survived the front. She had survived the missions that killed others. And then a head wound and concussion ended her war. She did not return to combat after that. And Janis Grieva, her commander, writes about it in a way that suggests he understood exactly what had been lost. There was another Jewish sniper on the Leningrad front. Her name was Margarita Khodorkovskaya. She was from Odessa Oblast, a fourth-year law student at Leningrad University when the Germans invaded. She served 3 years defending Leningrad as a sniper. She is not as well documented as Shura Erenshtein, but one figure from her record stands out. She killed 30 Germans in the direct observation of a single fellow soldier who documented it. These were not anomalies, they were expressions of a pattern. A pattern that the Red Army saw in division after division, in the Latvian formations, in the Lithuanian formations, where Jewish soldiers sometimes made up 23% of a medical battalion or 17% of an entire division. The fourth most decorated ethnic group in the Soviet Union, the seventh largest by population. More than 160,000 medals awarded, more than 150 named hero of the Soviet Union. And there was Bella Epstein. Bella Epstein was a Jewish sniper who at one point received an order to remain at divisional headquarters, a safer posting, away from the active front. Her response, recorded and preserved, was as simple and final as anything said in the entire war. She said, "No, we're snipers. Send us where we're supposed to go." That is a sentence that requires no commentary. By the end of the war, between 140,000 and 160,000 Jewish soldiers of the Red Army were dead. The Soviet Union had fielded a military of 20 million. The Jews were, at most, 2.5% of that number. Their proportion of the dead was higher than their proportion of the army. This is what proportionally disproportionate volunteering for dangerous positions produces, at scale. It produces a death toll that exceeds your share of the fighting force. It is the arithmetic of choosing the front. Shura Erenshtein came home. She built a life in the Soviet Union after the war. She had a daughter named Fiera. She did not speak about the war very often. And then around 1962, when Fiera was 11 or 12 years old, something happened at a friend's house. Shura and a friend were sitting together, probably talking about the war, and without warning, Shura began to say there was fire all around her and her head was burning. It was not a hot day. It was an ordinary cool day. But Shura could feel the burning. The head wound that had taken her off the front line had not gone away. It had simply gone inside. She wrote about her years of service once, not often, just once, and what she wrote was this: "The war tore our youth into pieces and scattered them along the front roads. It also buried happiness, love, and dreams there." Margarita Khodorkovskaya became a detective at the Soviet Ministry of Internal Affairs after the war. She eventually rose to the rank of police colonel. And then, in 1997, she moved to Germany. She had spent decades looking for something. She eventually found it at a place called Herbertshausen, a shooting range for Wehrmacht soldiers, 5 kilometers from Dachau, where approximately 7,000 Soviet prisoners of war had been brought as live targets. Margarita Khodorkovskaya spent the final portion of her life identifying the names and fates of 800 of those prisoners. A woman who had spent 3 years killing Germans in the snow of Leningrad spent her retirement trying to find the names of the people the Germans had killed. That is the shape of a life after a war like this one. The Soviet proposal for a Jewish fighting division was rejected in 1943. The state did not want a Jewish unit. It wanted Jewish soldiers to be Soviet soldiers, undifferentiated, absorbed into the larger narrative of the unified Soviet people. And what the Jewish soldiers did, in response to that erasure, was become individually extraordinary, because they had no unit to be part of. They had no formation that acknowledged who they were and what they were fighting for. They had only themselves, and the Mosin-Nagant rifle, and the frozen ground, and the knowledge of what was happening to their families in the towns behind the German lines. The Red Army's political leadership noticed. They wrote it down. They said, in an internal document that was not meant for publication, that the Jews were among the most loyal soldiers in the entire war. And what they did not say, what they could not say, in that language, in that system, was why. The why was Riga. The why was 49 family members. The why was an orphanage in Uzbekistan where Shura Erenshtein had to leave her brothers because there was no food. The why was the arithmetic of grief that a veteran from Berdyshev expressed with brutal simplicity in a recorded interview decades after the war. I took consolation in the fact that I killed more Germans than they did of my own family. The Soviet state suppressed this history for 50 years. It did not fit the narrative. The Great Patriotic War was a story about the Soviet people, and the Soviet people had one story: they stood together, they fought together, they won together. The particular Jewish story, the particular Jewish motivation, the particular Jewish dead did not have a place in that version. It was only after the fall of communism, in the 1990s, and then especially from 2005 onward through the work of the Blavatnik Archive Foundation, that the full scale of Jewish service in the Red Army began to be systematically documented. Interviews with more than 1,100 veterans across 11 countries, letters from the front, photographs from family albums, diaries that were technically forbidden to keep, but that soldiers kept anyway. A woman in Boston with 50 years of medals on her sweater and 49 names she still remembered. Here is the thing about Shura Erenshtein lying in the snow. She was not there because anyone told her she had to be. The medical orderly posting was already a frontline assignment. She could have stayed there. She chose to complete sniper training on top of it. She chose the additional skill, the additional mission, the additional cold. She asked to be made more dangerous. She asked for more ways to fight. The Red Army noticed this quality in Jewish soldiers throughout the war and had no framework adequate to explain it, because explaining it would have required acknowledging something the Soviet state was unwilling to acknowledge, that the Jews of Eastern Europe were not simply Soviet citizens fighting a war. They were a people being erased from the earth while the war was happening, and some of them had rifles. And some of them were very, very good with those rifles. 300 Jews rose to the rank of general or admiral by the end of the war, the fourth most decorated ethnicity in the Soviet Union, 160,000 medals, more than 150 heroes of the Soviet Union. And Shura Erenshtein, who lay in the snow for a whole winter's day and came back frozen and lucky, who ended the war with 70 kills and a head wound, and a sentence about happiness buried in the front roads, who never stopped being a young woman from Riga who put her brothers in an orphanage, and then went to war so that no one else would have to do what the Germans had done to her family. She did not do it for the medal. She did not do it for Stalin. She did it because Bella Epstein said it cleanly: "We are snipers. Send us where we are supposed to go." The system rejected a Jewish division. History gave us something better. It gave us Shura Erenshtein in the snow, alone, patient, precise, and very hard to kill. These stories were buried for 50 years. Remember them. What would you have done in her position? Not in the snow, before the snow, when the Germans were still on the other side of the border, and the question was only this: do you volunteer? Leave your answer below. And if you want the stories that were buried the longest and deserve the most light, you know where the subscribe button is.